The acrid, stinging scent of gunpowder from the deployed airbag mixed with the thick, metallic stench of blood, instantly filling the cramped cabin of the sedan. Alara Vance's forehead was pressed against the steering wheel. A warm liquid trailed down her temple, flooding her left eye and tinting her vision a blinding crimson. From her left knee came the nauseating sensation of a bone shattered and out of alignment. Panting, she cast her gaze downward. The hem of her white silk dress was torn, and blood was gushing at a terrifying rate, visibly pooling. The torrential rain lashing in through the shattered driver's side window mingled with the blood, spreading a pale, agonizing pink stain across the silk. An excruciating pain shot up her nerves, settling at the base of her skull. With a trembling, uncertain right hand, she reached for her smartphone, which had fallen onto the passenger floor mat. The screen was spider-webbed with cracks, but it still emitted a faint glow. The first line in her recent calls showed 2 words: Sterling Thorne. It was his last voicemail, sent 10 minutes ago when she had rushed out of their Upper East Side penthouse to bring him the preliminary documents for an urgent mergers and acquisitions deal. Today is the signing day for a multi-billion-dollar project. Unless the sky is falling, I am not to be disturbed for any reason. Alara's fingertip hovered over the call button. A drop of coagulated blood from beneath her fingernail fell onto the screen, obscuring his name. Thump. Thump. Someone from the outside violently banged on her window. Alara painfully turned her neck. Beyond the shattered glass and the torrential downpour, a woman in a red haute couture dress stood in the rain, unharmed. Holding a clear umbrella, she glared at Alara with a face twisted in rage. "How the hell do you drive? Are you blind? You ran a red light." Kareen's shrill voice pierced the sound of the rain and filled the car. Wearing a pair of 4-inch Louboutin stilettos, Kareen viciously kicked the door of Alara's unrecognizable sedan. "You completely totaled my front bumper. Do you have any idea who bought me this custom Aston Martin?" Alara swallowed the saliva and blood pooling in her throat and slightly lowered the window. Failure to yield. It was 100% her fault. Her voice was terribly low and hoarse, devoid of any emotional inflection. "Let's call the NYPD and file a report." Hearing the mention of the police, Kareen scoffed, as if she had heard an unbelievable joke, and immediately pulled out her own phone. "I'm warning you. You picked the absolute worst day for this. My man is on his way, and he has a vicious temper. Get ready to rot in a cell." Kareen dialed. Her voice, sharp as a razor a second prior, morphed into a whiny, almost childlike whimper the moment the line connected. "Sterling, baby, I've been in an accident. I'm right by Columbus Circle. I'm so scared it's pouring and I'm shaking everywhere. Can you please come get me?" Inside the car, Alara's hand, clutching her own phone, went rigid. Her knuckles, clenched with excessive force, turned as pale as a corpse's. Sterling Thorne. Today at 3 p.m. in the financial district, he was supposed to sign the final multi-billion-dollar merger for Thorne Capital. Over the past 5 years, in Sterling's world, work had always been the absolute priority. And for 5 long years, she had respected that rule. Even when she suffered an anaphylactic shock from a severe fever, she had called a cab to the ER by herself because he was in the middle of a board meeting. It was 2:15 p.m. Kareen hung up and shot a triumphant glare at Alara, who was bleeding and half dead inside her car. Then, clicking her heels, Kareen moved back to stand docilely beside her luxury sports car, waiting. Alara lowered her eyelashes, staring at Sterling's name on her cracked screen for 10 long seconds. Then, she slid her thumb and tapped another number at the bottom of her favorites list. The phone rang exactly once before someone answered. "Yeah?" A low, icy male voice responded. "Darian," Alara said, her gaze still fixed on her knee, which continued to pour blood. Her voice didn't waver. "I was in an accident at Columbus Circle. Shattered left knee. I think I'll need surgery." On the other end of the line, there was the deafening crash of a chair being kicked over, followed by a low, furious roar. "Alara, are you crazy? I'll be there in 10 minutes. Who the hell hit you? And where the fuck is that bastard Sterling Thorne? He's busy." Alara uttered those 2 words and immediately hung up. The rain intensified. Less than 5 minutes later, the screech of tires tore through the deluge at Columbus Circle. A black Maybach sliced through the sheets of water like a ghost and stopped abruptly, barely 30 feet from Alara's car. The door flew open, and the man who was supposed to be signing a multi-billion-dollar contract stepped out with a commanding stride. Wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit, he didn't even bother with an umbrella, letting the driving rain mercilessly hit his sharp, cold jawline. Sterling Thorne. Alara watched him through the crumpled windshield. This man, so familiar that his presence was etched into her very bones. In that instant, she couldn't breathe. The rain washing over the glass distorted her vision. She watched Sterling take long strides toward Karine. Karine threw away her umbrella and, like a frightened little bird, dove into his arms, clutching his soaked shirt, her face pale. Sterling, I was so scared. I thought I'd never see you again. Sterling bowed his head, resting a large hand on the nape of her neck, comforting her. Then, he unbuttoned his suit jacket, a masterpiece of tailoring worth tens of thousands of dollars, and wrapped it tenderly and securely around Karine's completely uninjured body. He whispered something to her, and Karine stopped crying, offering a radiant smile and a nod. The distance between them was 40 feet. On one side was his wife, with a shattered knee. Her white dress dyed a pale pink from her own blood, the metallic scent filling her lungs with every breath. On the other side was his mistress, without a single scratch, merely frightened. Leaning back against the seat, Alara suddenly felt a terrible spasm in her stomach, as if it were twisting itself into knots. She bit her lip until she tasted iron, suppressing the urge to vomit. No tears fell. When a person is in too much pain, they can't even cry. Protecting Karine, Sterling guided her toward the passenger side of his Maybach. Before opening the door, he paused for a fraction of a second and slightly turned his head. His deep eyes peered through the rain toward the white sedan with its front end completely destroyed, 40 feet away. Alara sat in the darkness, watching him. His gaze fell upon her car's license plate. 1 second. A second and a half. He had given her that car, casually instructing his assistant to buy her something practical for commuting. In 5 years, he had never once ridden in it, and naturally, he hadn't memorized the plate. After a second and a half, Sterling's expression remained impassive. He looked away, opened the door, and helped Karine inside. Then he returned to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life in a low growl, rolling over a puddle and sending a spray of dirty water against Alara's broken window. He was gone. He hadn't waited for the NYPD. He hadn't left a single word to ask if the other driver was okay. He had abandoned her there, critically injured, like a lifeless piece of scrap metal in an intersection under the pouring rain. Alara watched the taillights vanish behind the veil of rain. Slowly, she loosened the death grip her right hand had on the steering wheel. 2 shards of glass were embedded deep in her palm, leaving it bloody. At that exact moment, from the opposite lane, blinding headlights flooded her cabin. 3 black Cadillac Escalades mercilessly crossed the double yellow lines, completely blocking the intersection. Even before the center SUV stopped fully, a man in a luxury trench coat vaulted out into the rain. Darian Vance. The heir to Vance Enterprises, and the true powerhouse of New York's wealthiest family. Alara's brother, Darian sprinted to the crumpled door. Seeing the horrific scene inside, his eyes went bloodshot in an instant. He punched the mangled doorframe and roared at the bodyguards piling out behind him. "Are you insane? Get the hydraulic jaws right now. Tell the chief of surgery at Lenox Hill to prep an emergency trauma team immediately." While the bodyguards rapidly dismantled the door, Darian gently supported Alara's back to hold her. His voice was trembling. "Don't be afraid. Your big brother is here. I'm getting you out. Everything is going to be fine. It's going to be absolutely fine." Alara let herself be lifted from the wreckage, anchored by his strength. The rain washed over her face, clearing the blood to reveal a pallid, lifeless complexion. "Darian," Alara said, resting her head on his shoulder, her voice as light as a feather. "Have 2 documents prepared for me." Darian, his eyes red with fury and grief, moved carefully, avoiding her ruined left leg. "What documents?" Alara closed her eyes. A single raindrop fell from her eyelashes. "One is the divorce settlement. The other is a copy of the employment contract the United States Geological Survey sent me 5 years ago." Darian stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down in disbelief at the sister he held in his arms. 5 years. For 5 years, the Vance family had tried to dissuade her, with tears and shouting, from this secret marriage to a man they believed wasn't worthy of her. She, acting like someone possessed, had reduced herself to a shadow, a nobody living in the background of Sterling Thorne's life. But today, finally, She had woken up. "Where is that bastard Sterling Thorne?" Darian gritted his teeth, the veins in his neck bulging with rage. "He left with another woman." Alara's tone was terrifyingly calm. "He dared to do this?" Darian exploded. "I will bankrupt Thorne Capital by the end of the day." "Darian?" Alara interrupted him. She opened her eyes, and in her pupils, there wasn't even hatred anymore, only an absolute, glacial void. "Don't touch him. I will make him spit out everything he has, piece by piece, all by himself." 40 minutes later, outside the emergency operating room at Lenox Hill Hospital, Alara lay on a gurney, her left leg perfectly immobilized. The anesthesiologist stood beside her with a syringe. "Mrs. Thorne, we are prepping you for general anesthesia. The bone is severely fragmented, and the reconstructive process will be agonizing." "No, General. Spinal block," Alara said. "Alara!" Darian was by her side, pale as a sheet. "They have to scrape the bone fragments and insert titanium plates. You'll hear the drills. You can't endure the psychological trauma of being awake for that." "Spinal block," Alara repeated, her eyes fixed on the stark white ceiling of the operating room. "I need my hands to work and my mind clear. I have things to sign." The chief surgeon sighed deeply and nodded. For the next 3 hours, the scalpel sliced through skin and muscle, and forceps extracted shards of glass embedded in the bone. Every time the metal tools struck bone with a dull thud, Alara's body was racked with violent, involuntary physiological spasms. She bit down on the gauze they had placed in her mouth with all her strength, cold sweat soaking her hospital gown. But she never uttered a single groan. A heavy titanium reconstructive plate and 14 surgical screws were drilled deep into the shattered fragments of her left knee. The attending nurse burst into tears, and out in the hallway, Darian kicked a heavy steel trash can until it was dented beyond recognition. At 1 a.m., the surgery ended. Alara was transferred to a VIP luxury suite. As the spinal block wore off, the excruciating pain like flesh, being continuously ripped from the bone, amplified tenfold. Darian entered, his eyes red, holding a stack of papers. "My lawyers printed everything." Alara took the pen with a trembling hand. On the signature line for the spouses on the divorce agreement, she signed her maiden name without a second of hesitation. Her handwriting was sharp and precise, almost piercing the paper. Then, she picked up her phone. The screen was shattered, but it functioned. She opened iMessage. At the top was the usual status report from Sterling's executive assistant. "Ma'am, Mr. Thorne closed tonight's deal smoothly. He is currently at a celebration gala, so he will be returning to the penthouse a bit late. Should I have his midnight snack prepared and leave the door unlocked?" Alara stared at that message for 2 seconds. In her mind flashed the blinding headlights from that second and a half, and the Tom Ford jacket wrapped tightly around Corinne's body. Her fingers moved imperceptibly. She tapped Sterling's profile picture. She didn't reply. She didn't ask for explanations. Block caller. Confirm. Then, she scrolled through her contacts and found a number she hadn't dialed in 5 years. The phone rang, and the call connected. "This is Alara Vance," she said. Her voice, due to the severe blood loss, was incredibly weak, but her enunciation was frighteningly clear. "Dr. Alden, the position of lead geologist for the extreme terrain expedition in the Rockies you offered me 5 years ago. Is it still available?" A dead silence fell over the line, followed by an explosion of sheer disbelief. "Alara? Good God, have you finally decided to walk out of that hell? Of course the position is open. The USGS has kept that spot warm for you since the day you left. Good." Alara looked down at her heavily casted left leg and narrowed her eyes. "I will report to the team in 2 weeks." She hung up. The rain battering New York had finally stopped. Alara tossed the phone onto the nightstand and closed her eyes. Her secret 5-year marriage, as miserable and insignificant as dust, ended without a sound in a hospital room steeped in the pungent smell of antiseptic. But across town, in the Upper East Side penthouse, everything was just about to begin. "Miss Vance, we need to clear out the entire walk-in closet." On the video call screen, one of Darian's security men stood in the master bedroom of the penthouse, holding several large black contractor trash bags. Alara, lying in her hospital bed, didn't look at the screen. She kept her head down, carefully swabbing the glass cuts on her right hand with iodine. "No need," her voice rasped slightly from the surgery. "Open the bottom drawer. Inside, there's an old gray 6.5-liter Osprey trekking backpack. The bodyguard opened the drawer and pulled out a weathered canvas backpack, its corners frayed and faded. Only pack what's inside that backpack. Leave all the designer clothes, the jewelry, and the Birkin bags. Don't touch anything else. The bodyguard panned the camera over the racks of luxury bags, many still with price tags in the thousands of dollars, looking confused. You're not taking any of this? No. Alara tossed the cotton swab in the trash. Go to the kitchen. Find the 3 glass jars with yellow labels sitting on the counter. Throw them in the garbage disposal. Leave everything else exactly as it is, and vacate the penthouse in 5 minutes. Understood. The call ended. Alara leaned back against her pillows, watching the weak light of dawn filter through the window. For 5 years in this marriage, she had abandoned all her geological exploration projects and transformed herself into a precise machine that functioned seamlessly to maintain Sterling Thorne's world. Now, the only thing she was taking with her was the old backpack she had used 5 years ago on a survey of Mount Elbert. She closed her eyes and gently rested her right hand on her heavily casted knee. 3 days later, at 11:45 p.m., the biometric lock on the Upper East Side penthouse emitted a soft beep. Sterling Thorne pushed the door open. He smelled strongly of scotch and carried the icy aura of the boardroom. The lights were off. Usually, the moment his private elevator opened, the warm amber sconces in the foyer would automatically light up. But tonight, the entire penthouse was as silent and still as a massive block of black ice. He frowned, carelessly tossing his bespoke jacket onto the bench by the shoe rack. He stepped forward out of habit, expecting to slip his feet into slippers, positioned precisely at a 15-degree angle and warmed to 95 degrees. Instead, his foot hit the cold, hard marble floor. Sterling paused. In the dark, he flicked on the main living room lights. A blinding white glare illuminated the empty space. Alara, he called out in his usual cold, authoritative voice while loosening his tie. No response. He walked toward the kitchen island. Over the past 3 days, the endless galas and drinking on an empty stomach had caused his chronic ulcers to twist into a dull, gnawing pain. Instinctively, he reached for the smart thermos on the counter. For the past 5 years, whenever he came home after an event, a ginger chamomile stomach infusion was waiting, kept exactly at 180 degrees. Beside it, there was always a small bowl of bone broth, simmered for hours and served at precisely 113 degrees to sober him up and coat his stomach. His fingertips brushed the surface of the thermos. It was cold. The digital display read 75 degrees. There was no broth beside it, only an empty white porcelain bowl. Sterling's brow furrowed uncontrollably. He pulled out his phone and dialed Alara. A cold, mechanical voice answered, "We're sorry. The number you have reached is no longer in service." Sterling's eyelids twitched violently. He opened iMessage and found her chat. Her profile picture, a snow-capped mountain range. He typed, "Where are you?" and hit send. The message instantly turned green, followed by a glaring red exclamation point. Not delivered. He stared at the red alert, panting slightly. He scoffed, slamming the phone down hard onto the marble island with a sharp clack. "Is this a protest? Just because I didn't answer the phone on the day of the merger? You want to play these childish games of running away and blocking me?" After 5 years of being a submissive, emotionless shadow, she was now trying to get his attention with these cheap tricks. Clutching his weakly spazzing stomach, he opened the drawer under the counter to find the loose-leaf teas himself. The moment he pulled it open, he froze. The standard tea tins, perfectly categorized by fermentation level and origin, were still there. But the 3 glass jars with yellow labels, her custom herbal blends specifically prepared to calm his stress-induced stomach cramps, which should have been front and center, were completely gone. Sterling's fingers hovered in midair for 2 seconds before slowly retracting. Fine. He spat into the empty room. He turned and marched upstairs toward the master bedroom. It's not like the world stopped spinning without you. The next morning, at 7 a.m. sharp, his biological clock woke him up. He sat up and instinctively reached for his nightstand. Usually, there would be a glass of warm lemon water and the Wall Street Journal. His fingertips brushed against a thin layer of dust. Nothing was there. Frowning, he walked into the master bathroom. On the vanity, his electric toothbrush sat on its charger. The toothpaste had not been squeezed out in the precise 0.2-inch measurement, and there was no cup of lukewarm water to rinse his mouth. Impassive, he grabbed the toothpaste tube himself. When the cold tap water hit his mouth, his stomach contracted again, sending a sharp jolt of pain through him. He splashed his face and opened the doors to the massive walk-in closet. At 10 a.m., he had an extremely important video conference for a multinational acquisition. He walked to his section and opened the drawer for his dress shirts and ties. The moment he saw the inside, his pupils contracted sharply. It was full and empty at the same time. At first glance, the closet was still packed with expensive bespoke suits. But the specific section dedicated to his weekly work attire, which Alara usually pre-arranged using velvet dividers from Monday to Friday, matching ties and cufflinks perfectly to his schedule, was completely bare. Only the wooden hangers remained, stripped naked. He snapped his head toward Alara's side of the closet. The designer dresses he had bought her, the limited edition luxury bags he had casually ordered his assistant to have delivered, they were all sitting there, perfectly ordered, still in their dust bags. But the bottom drawer was slightly ajar, entirely empty. Sterling stood there staring at the empty drawer, his fists clenching. He grabbed a randomly wrinkled shirt, threw it on, and marched downstairs, dialing his assistant, Hayes. The moment the call connected, Sterling's icy voice erupted. "Where is Alara? Mr. Thorne?" Hayes's voice trembled slightly. The building security company confirmed that Mrs. Thorne deleted all her biometric data from the penthouse access system 3 days ago. And Ma'am's car was transferred yesterday to the NYPD impound lot. It was totaled in a severe traffic collision. Sterling's footsteps stopped dead in the middle of the living room. "Collision?" "Yes, sir. Exactly 3 days ago, when you picked up Miss Kareen at Columbus Circle. According to the police report, the owner of the vehicle that was hit, the one positioned less than 40 feet from your car, was Mrs. Thorne." Sterling's mind went blank for 3 full seconds. 3 days ago. The pouring rain. The white sedan with its front end completely destroyed, leaking fluids onto the asphalt. At the time, he had glanced at the license plate, but he hadn't even realized it was a car registered in his name. And her? Sterling's voice grew dark. There was a note of panic in it that even he didn't recognize. "Unknown, sir." The police stated she didn't get into the city ambulance. She was extracted by several private SUVs. Currently, there is no admission record under her name in any major ER in Manhattan. Sterling hung up. He looked around the vast, empty penthouse. Suddenly, he felt as if an invisible, suffocating gas was slowly corroding his lungs. By the third night, at 2 a.m., another thunderstorm hit New York. In his executive office at the top of the Thorne Capitol skyscraper, Sterling sat rigidly in his leather chair, holding a stack of documents. A cold, dense sweat coated his forehead. His stomach cramps had returned, worse than ever before. It felt as if someone had shoved a hand into his gut and was violently twisting his insides. For the past 3 days, he hadn't had a single sip of water at the right temperature, nor eaten a meal with the perfect macro proportions. His stomach, weakened to the extreme by Alara's meticulous care over 5 years, had finally declared a full systemic strike. With a trembling hand, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Usually, there would be vacuum-sealed alkaline crackers packed by Alara for emergencies, but the drawer held only cold file folders. Sterling stood up abruptly, but a sharp stab of pain made him stumble, his knee slamming violently against the corner of the heavy oak desk. Gritting his teeth, he grabbed his keys and drove like a maniac back to the penthouse. Rain lashed his windshield, blurring the city lights. He stumbled into the living room and rushed to the built-in medicine cabinet next to the media center. "Alara," he panted, yanking open the left drawer. Usually, there was a clear, 7-day pill organizer there. Alara would cut his stomach meds, liver supplements, and imported vitamins into the exact dosages for morning, noon, and night. He only ever had to swallow a handful each day. The drawer flew open. The 7-day organizer was gone. Instead, there was a massive first aid box, filled only with the original prescription bottles bearing complicated medical labels. Sterling's fingers trembled as he rummaged through the box, searching for a familiar blue bottle. Found it. He shook out 2 pills and raised them to his mouth, but his gaze casually fell on the label at the bottom. Expiration date, May 2023. They had expired 3 years ago. He froze, frantically picking up the other bottles. Expired. All of them. In other words, The medication he had been taking for the past 5 years was never what was in this box. It was Alara who, every single month, went to the pharmacy to get fresh prescriptions, popped out the pills one by one, placed them in the organizer, and left only the empty boxes and expired bottles hidden in the back. With a terrifying, patient perfection, she had woven herself into his very veins, and he had mistaken all of it for a divine right owed to him. With a pain that felt like a blade slicing through his gut, Sterling leaned against the cabinet and slid down the wall until he hit the floor. Cold sweat dripped from his chin onto the marble. With a shaking hand, he picked up his backup phone and dialed the number burned into his memory. Ring. Ring. Surprisingly, the line connected. Hello? Alara's voice came through cold, dry, without the slightest hesitation. He could even hear the rustle of pages turning in the background. Hearing that voice, Sterling's Adam's apple bobbed violently, and his heart plummeted. Alara, he called out, panting, his voice terribly broken. The dosage for my stomach medication. I think I built a tolerance. How many months am I supposed to take it for? There was a second of silence on the other end. Bottom left drawer, 2 blue pills, 1 white. Alara's tone was as if she were reading meaningless lab data. Sterling, with a trembling hand, opened the bottom left drawer just as she said. It was empty. There was nothing inside but a stray bandage. It's empty. Sterling's knuckles turned white. Alara, there's nothing in here. Correct. Her voice remained flat. I cut off your supply on the 15th of last month. Since Corrine brings you your umbrella, why don't you ask her to buy your meds too? I have to review a fault line report now. Goodbye. Alara! You! Sterling's eyes went bloodshot as he yelled into the receiver. Beep, beep, beep. The dead dial tone echoed through the vast, empty living room. Sterling stared at the black screen. A moment later, a spasm that felt like it was tearing his stomach in half overtook him. He let out a guttural, animalistic groan, his hand springing open. The phone dropped onto the marble floor, shattering into pieces. A massive 50-page letter of intent was pushed precisely to the center of the... Sterling sat on a luxury leather sofa, his legs crossed, wearing a pitch-black, wrinkle-free bespoke suit. An ironclad control perfectly masked his pallor. His sharp jawline was slightly raised, and with the domineering gaze typical of an apex predator, he stared at the heavily sweating foundation head. $100 million. Sterling's voice lacked any emotion. Thorn Capital will fully fund all of your foundation's equipment grants for the federal government this year. In exchange, you will use your leverage as their primary supplier to blacklist Alara Vance from their upcoming field deployments. Pull her clearance. I never want to see her resume approved for any mountain expedition. Whether as an external consultant or a data manager, it doesn't matter. I never want to see her resume circulating in any geological institution in the United States. Do not approve her hire. In 3 days, all his executive team had managed to find scouring. New York from top to bottom was that Alara's IP address had frequently accessed the internal literature database of this research institute. Sterling scoffed internally. A woman who had been cooped up at home for 5 years, dealing only with cooking and pills, just because she ran away, now wanted to dust off her old college major to submit a resume? She dared to think she could survive in this ruthless corporate society with her pathetic basic knowledge after leaving the massive nuclear fallout shelter that was Sterling Thorn? There was a limit even to a woman's tantrums. If he cut off every escape route and destroyed her naive illusions, after tasting the bitterness of the real world, she would clearly realize who was the only pillar she could lean on. Miss? Alara Vance? The man's eyes widened in utter shock, as if he had heard the most absurd name on the planet. The person you are referring to, is that Alara Vance? She is my wife. There's no need to pretend you don't know her. Sterling's gaze turned sharp and glacial, dripping with annoyance. With $100 million, I am blocking her path. For you, sir, this is a deal where you lose absolutely nothing. Now sign it. Bang. At that moment, the heavy double oak doors of the office were kicked open violently from the outside with a deafening crash. The coffee cups on the desk jumped, spilling dark liquid onto the marble table. Sterling's fingers, which had been tapping his knee, stopped. He frowned, his cold gaze shifting to the door. 4 heavily built bodyguards in black suits flooded in, taking positions on either side of the doorway. Behind them, radiating a lethal aura, a man in a luxury trench coat strode in. Darian Vance, the wealthiest man in New York, and the true overlord of Vance Enterprises. Mr. Thorne attempting to crush someone with a mere $100 million. Don't you think your vision is a bit narrow? Darian approached the desk. Without even looking at Sterling, he snatched the letter of intent. Rip. Right in front of Sterling, he tore the $100 million contract in half. Sterling's eyelids twitched uncontrollably. He stood up slowly. Matching Darian in height, his gaze locked with the other man's in a tense, silent war. The air between them instantly froze, dropping below zero. Mr. Vance. Sterling's voice was as cold as ice shards. This is a private matter between my wife and me. Vance Enterprises has no right to interfere with Thorne Capital's investments. Or is Mr. Vance planning to start a corporate war over a woman who has nothing to do with you, a woman who belongs to me? Darian burst into a sarcastic laugh, as if he had heard the funniest joke in the universe. He threw the torn pieces of the contract onto the rug and turned, piercing Sterling's face with a glare as sharp as a blade. Sterling Thorne, you thought Alara married you to climb the social ladder, clinging to my multi-billion-dollar background, didn't you? You thought that for the past 5 years, she stayed holed up in that penthouse, brewing your teas and coddling your fragile fucking stomach because she was a useless woman, incapable of doing anything but depending on you, right? Sterling's frown deepened. He couldn't understand why Darian was interfering, nor where the terrible, consuming hatred in his voice came from. The woman has no real-world experience and no solid background, Sterling said calmly, not hiding his arrogance. After a marital spat, she ran away from home. Blocking her useless contacts and job channels to force her back is the most efficient solution. Mr. Vance, this is a power struggle within a marriage. You've crossed the line. Power struggle. Efficient. Darian ground his teeth and sneered coldly. He reached out his hand to his assistant, who immediately pulled a heavy manila envelope from a briefcase and handed it over. Sterling Thorne, the most stupid mistake of my life was allowing your disgusting, controlling behavior. Darian slammed the envelope onto the coffee table in front of Sterling with a heavy thud. Open it. See for yourself what a pathetic, arrogant bastard you've been. Sterling's gaze fell on the unlabeled envelope. For some reason, his usually steady heartbeat began to falter erratically. As he reached for the envelope, his fingertips stiffened with an inexplicable sense of dread. He unwound the string and pulled out the documents. The top page was slightly yellowed at the edges. At the top sat the vivid emblem of the Department of the Interior, United States Geological Survey. Sterling's eyes swept over the text. Letter of Employment. Dear Alara Vance, in recognition of your exceptional achievements during your studies at the Colorado School of Mines and your extraordinary merit as a summa cum laude valedictorian, we have decided to appoint you, via an expedited executive process, as the lead geologist for the Extreme Terrain Special Expedition in the Rocky Mountains under the auspices of the USGS. Date of appointment. 5 years ago, the knuckles of Sterling's fingers holding the paper lost their color in an instant, turning a sickly gray. His breathing stopped. Colorado School of Mines. Top of her class. Valedictorian. Lead geologist. Those words were like cold iron hammers that, without warning, smashed the arrogant cognitive system he had blindly believed in for 5 years. 5 years ago, when his grandfather had introduced Alara to him, the old man had simply said she was a quiet, obedient girl, meant to be kept at home as a wife. Sterling had never bothered to look into her. He had ignored her, thinking she wasn't even worth the effort. This isn't possible. Sterling's voice was completely broken. He stared at the employment letter as if trying to burn a hole through it. Right after she graduated with highest honors, she married a son of a bitch like you. Darian, his eyes bloodshot, violently grabbed Sterling by the lapels of his suit. 5 years ago, my grandfather, claiming he needed to repay a debt of gratitude from the previous generation, pushed her to the edge of the cliff. Alara tore up that offer letter with her own hands, a letter the best geologists in the country wouldn't get if they dedicated their entire lives to it just to marry you. She used the mind of one of the nation's top disaster experts to calculate exactly what time you needed your tea and your stomach meds. Sterling's body had turned to stone. His mind was filled with white noise. She wasn't a dependent vine incapable of standing on her own. She had broken her own massive wings, voluntarily dragged herself to the ground, and locked herself within the 4 cold, inflexible clauses of their marriage contract. And he, just moments ago, had used a pathetic sum of $100 million to try and pave over the runway she was finally trying to take off from again. You think that's it? Darian shoved him away roughly and threw the second document from the envelope at his face. Papers scattered across the floor, a black and white X-ray, and an emergency medical chart from Lenox Hill Hospital. Sterling's gaze was forced onto the X-ray. It was a shattered knee joint. White dots, so dense they induced shivers, cruelly pierced the spaces between the broken bones like dozens of nails. Patient: Alara Vance. Diagnosis: comminuted fracture of the left femoral condyle. Removal of necrotic tissue and insertion of a reconstructive titanium plate and 14 surgical screws. Type of anesthesia: spinal. Sterling's pupils trembled, as if a magnitude 8 earthquake were hitting him. 37. The moment he unconsciously muttered that number, an explosive spasm, like a tsunami, ripped through his stomach. 3 days ago, at Columbus Circle, Darian's voice, mixed with ice shards, shredded Sterling's nerves one by one. In that crumpled wreck, less than 40 feet from your car, was Alara. Just to keep her mind clear enough to sign the divorce papers, she endured the drilling of 14 screws into her bone, wide awake, without making a single sound the entire surgery. The pouring rain. The black Maybach with the totaled custom sports car. The white sedan. That Tom Ford jacket he had taken off to wrap tenderly around Corrine. Those 1.5 seconds he had spent looking at that license plate for the last time. Sterling staggered. His knees gave out, and he barely managed to keep from collapsing to the floor by gripping the edge of the coffee table. He panted like a dying animal. Cold sweat instantly soaked his bespoke shirt. He had cursed at the car blocking his path. He had abandoned his own wife in a hell of blood and twisted metal with his own 2 hands. Ding! In the suffocating silence, a clear notification sounded from a smartphone. Darian pulled his phone from his pocket, checked the screen, and immediately hit speakerphone. Darian. Alara's voice emanating from the speaker was cold and calm, devoid of any emotional ripple. Sterling snapped his head up, his eyes blood red. He lunged toward the phone, almost crawling. His voice shook uncontrollably. Alara. Your leg. Your knee. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me? There was only the sound of papers rustling on the other end. Alara completely ignored his broken voice. Her tone was bureaucratic, as if handling paperwork. Darian. I finished filing the unilateral divorce petition with the New York Supreme Court. Did you review their statement of asset division? Stop it. Stop, Alara. Please, listen to me. Sterling's hands gripped the edge of the table as if trying to strangle it. His nails dug into the wood, leaving deep gouges. His voice was laced with a desperate panic and pleading he had never shown in his life. That accident. I didn't know it was you. If I had known, how could I have left you there? I haven't signed it. I signed. Alara cut off his words. 2 syllables. Short, precise, leaving absolutely zero emotional space. Sterling's breathing turned ragged. I won't sign. Where are you? Does your leg still hurt? I'm coming to you right now with the best orthopedic specialists in the country. Alara, please, stop this. Please, let's just stop. He was still trying to fix the situation with his capital and his power. On the other end of the phone, Alara fell silent for a second. Mr. Thorne. Her voice, transmitted across the cell towers, lacked any trace of warmth. Sterling's heart plummeted. For the first time in 5 years of marriage, she called him Mr. Thorne. That afternoon at 3 p.m. was the scheduled signing for Thorne Capital's multi-billion-dollar merger, correct? Alara's tone was indifferent, but every word was terrifyingly precise. The opposing party's flight was delayed due to the storm, and the signing was pushed to 5 p.m. But at 1:10 p.m., you were in the VIP lounge of a luxury dealership in Soho, picking out a custom sports car for Corrine. And at 2:45 p.m., as Corrine was leaving the dealership, she hit my car. Sterling's eyes widened so far they almost tore. His eyelids spasmed uncontrollably. His mind wiped completely blank, as if he had taken a sledgehammer to the skull. She knew. She knew everything. The things he thought he had hidden perfectly, the betrayals he was convinced would never be discovered. At the exact moment she was struck, she already clearly understood the entire truth. She had watched the whole process. She watched him lie shamelessly, run to another woman, and drape his jacket over her shoulders. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't shed a tear. Simply sitting in silence in her bleeding car, she had burned all the love of the past 5 years into ashes. You! A sound emerged from Sterling's throat as if it were packed with broken glass, incomprehensible. I'm throwing my tantrum, Alara's final voice said, steeped in an overwhelming contempt. The papers have been filed with the court. Have a long, happy life with your $100 million. Click. The call disconnected without regret. Sterling remained hunched over, staring at the black screen of the phone. Silence descended. A deathly silence. See clearly now? Darian looked down at him with a gaze mixing pity and mockery. Your money, your power, your arrogance. In Alara's eyes, it's just a ridiculous comedy. Now, you are nothing but trash that doesn't even reach the soles of her shoes. Darian turned and walked out of the office with his men. Only Sterling remained. Slowly, like a man drained of all his strength, he slumped onto the rug. In front of him lay the $100 million contract, reduced to scrap paper, and his fingertips touched the X-ray with the 14 white dots. His stomach hurt so much he couldn't breathe, but he couldn't even feel the physical pain anymore. He reached out a trembling hand to trace the spaces between the bone fragments on the film. The moment his fingertip touched the cold plastic, his body curled up in a violent convulsion, and a choked, animalistic sob erupted from his chest. It was over. The billions in wealth he was so proud of, and the control he believed was absolute, had been utterly trampled and mocked in the face of her 5-year-old employment letter and 14 titanium screws. A pale, absurdly ridiculous ending. At that exact moment, on the other side of New York, in a quiet, luxurious loft, Alara tossed her phone onto the desk. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the heavy cast encasing her left leg. Her nerves, stretched to the absolute limit during the call, finally relaxed slightly. Instantly, from deep within her knee, an agonizing pain as if a saw were cutting through the bone radiated outward. Ah. She held her breath and instinctively gripped the bedsheets with her right hand. Cold sweat broke out on her forehead. There was no one in the room. Only then did she furrow her brow, squeeze her eyes shut, and endure the excruciating physical pain alone for 5 seconds. 5 seconds later, she exhaled deeply and opened her eyes. Her gaze had returned to the realm of absolute logic. She reached out, grabbed a black Sharpie from the nightstand, and turned toward the calendar pinned to the wall. She drew a bright red circle around a date exactly 2 weeks from today. Beside it, in sharp handwriting, she wrote, Return to USGS. Base Camp 4. Finished writing, she dropped the pen. Leaning heavily on crutches with one good leg, she hobbled toward the closet. Into that old 6.5-liter Osprey backpack, with its frayed corners, she began packing, with zero margin for error, an extreme cold sleeping bag and specialized geological surveying tools. The old Alara was dead. All that remained was the massive blizzard she had to face. 6 years later, secondary fault line on the southeast bedrock. Sensor tilt values have breached the critical threshold. At 9,000 feet above sea level, deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains at the command center of the Mount Elbert mining operation, the emergency operations chief slammed his fist on the table, yelling into the radio mic with a voice that threatened to blow the tent away. Wind speed is hitting hurricane force. Supplies will only last 8 hours. The choppers can't even approach. Immediate evacuation of all personnel to Camp 2. We do not retreat. A low, cold voice, exuding absolute authority, came from a corner of the tent. Sterling Thorne, wearing an extreme weather expedition suit, sat on a canvas cot. Due to the thin mountain air and his chronic stress-induced stomach ulcers, his face was as pale as paper, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead, but his domineering willpower still froze the air in the tent. Over the past 6 years, he had used the massive financial power of Thorne Capital to scour every National Geological Research Institute, but he hadn't found a single trace of her. The chronic ulcers and extreme mental anguish had made his temper even more volatile. Even this field inspection was the result of insomnia and an unbearable anxiety. Thorne Capital invested $500 million just in the extraction equipment for rare earth minerals here. Sterling stared at the 3D topographical map on the desk, his brow furrowed. If we pull out now, the groundwater will flood the main control room and destroy it completely. My private extraction team is already staged at the base of the mountain. We will open a supply route within 12 hours. All personnel stay put. The crew chief, sweating profusely, threw his hands in the air. "Mr. Thorne, this isn't about money. The entire mountain is going to collapse after this blizzard. We don't even have a structural expert here capable of analyzing this extreme terrain. Staying here is suicide." Rumble. Before the chief could finish speaking, the deafening roar of a heavy-lift helicopter exploded outside the tent. Hurricane-force winds whipped ice shards against the canvas as if trying to shred it. A thermos fell off the table, spilling water across the floorboards. The comms officer ripped off his headset, slammed a fist on the console, and yelled excitedly, "It's a federal search and rescue chopper from the USGS. The lead geologist sent from HQ has arrived. They forced their way through the jet stream." The heavy canvas flap at the tent entrance was violently thrown back, and a hand clad in black tactical gloves reached inside. A freezing -2.2-degree gust, accompanied by blinding snow, devoured the space in an instant. Sterling instinctively narrowed his eyes and shielded his face with his forearm. A tall figure stepped inside with a commanding stride. She wore a dark blue USGS extreme weather parka, the federal badge and the American flag blazing vividly on her left shoulder. On her back, she carried an old, faded, 6.5-liter Osprey backpack. Her tactical boots crunched heavily and resolutely against the ice on the floor. When she pulled down her wind mask and removed her tactical goggles, two cold, piercing eyes were revealed. The silver badge of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, Joint Task Force gleamed coldly on her chest. "I am Alara Vance, lead geologist and incident commander for the Federal Response Team," she said. "Under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, I am officially suspending all commercial operations on this mountain. I am assuming supreme command of this evacuation. You have 20 minutes to abandon all heavy equipment and move out. Everyone. No exceptions." Clatter. The metal fountain pen Sterling had been using to mark the map dropped from his hand. It rolled across the floorboards and stopped right at the toe of Alara's tactical boot. The moment he saw her face, Sterling's breath stopped completely. 6 years. 2,000. 191 days. A time during which he had searched for her frantically, losing his mind in the process. He had imagined that when they finally met again, she would look at him with hatred, or perhaps show an exhausted expression. But he never, in his wildest dreams, imagined she would appear before him like this, like a sharpened military dagger, wielding the untouchable authority of a top-tier federal expert in the middle of a killer blizzard. Of that submissive, patient shadow from the past, not even 1% remained. The blinding light she emitted now overwhelmed him so much he could barely keep his eyes open. "Alara." Sterling stood up abruptly. He stood up so fast that a wave of intense vertigo hit him, and his knee slammed violently against the cot's iron frame, producing a dull thud. He didn't feel the pain. He stared at her as if trying to look right through her. In an instant, his eyes turned bloodshot, his chest heaving violently. Alara didn't spare him a single glance. She kept her head down, staring at the 3D map, and used her fingers to point out 3 precise coordinates, issuing rapid-fire orders. Expansion rate of the southeast fault is 4. These 3 observation points are already dead zones. Order the demolition squad to blow the water intake, and logistics to count the oxygen masks. 1 backup tank per person. Alara. Please, listen to me. Sterling took a step forward, pleading with a trembling voice. His Adam's apple bobbed painfully. Instinctively, he reached out to grab her arm. Only then did Alara slowly lift her head. Her gaze rested calmly on Sterling's hand, suspended in mid-air. No anger, no surprise, no emotional wave whatsoever. It was the exact look one gives an inanimate obstacle blocking a rescue operation. "Unauthorized personnel," Alara said. Her tone so flat it knocked the wind out of him, must step back behind the yellow control line. Sterling's fingers went rigid in mid-air. His knuckles turned a sickly gray-white. The crew chief finally snapped out of his shock. The financial power of Thorne Capital was terrifying, but facing the absolute authority of a federal expert in a life-or-death situation, there was no choice. The chief forcibly stepped between them. "Mr. Thorne, sir, you are an investor. It's too dangerous for you here. Please step back to the safe zone and comply with Dr. Vance's directives." But Sterling seemed deaf to the chief's words. His eyes were chained to Alara's face, the muscles in his jaw twitching uncontrollably. "I'll abandon all the equipment." Sterling's voice was terribly scratched and broken. There was a desperate begging in it that he didn't even realize he possessed. If my safety is guaranteed, I don't care if the $500 million I invested goes up in smoke. My private extraction team is on its way up. Come with me. You don't have to stay here. He was still, out of sheer habit, trying to control the situation with his resources and his money. It was a vain attempt to arrogantly lock her back under his protective wing. Alara picked up the radio on the desk and keyed the mic. Her voice was steady and heavy. Team 1. Report on groundwater levels. Groundwater level has breached the 20% mark. A frantic voice cracked back over the radio. After setting the radio down, Alara shifted her gaze back to Sterling. Mr. Thorne. She pronounced his title without half a second of hesitation. It was so fluent and dry, as if she were addressing a stranger she had met for the first time that day. Your highly touted private extraction team illegally breached a Level 1 restriction zone 3 hours ago. They were hit by an avalanche and are currently trapped at the base of the mountain. Sterling's eyelids twitched like crazy. Alara pulled a carefully folded satellite weather map from the inner pocket of her parka. Using 2 fingers, she slid it across the table, right under Sterling's nose. Do you think the southeast bedrock is collapsing for no reason? Sterling looked down at the map. Dozens of points were densely marked with red ink, accompanied by precise stress test data. It's because the construction firm owned by Thorne Capital, in order to beat your delivery deadlines over the last 2 months, illegally used heavy-yield explosives in Sector 3. 34 times. Alara looked him dead in the eye. Mixed in her pupils were the contempt and pity of a supreme judge. I am here to clean up your greedy, idiotic mess. So shut your mouth and get out of the way. Sterling's feet were nailed to the floor. His breathing was completely disjointed. The power of his arrogant capital, which he believed in blindly, and the elite rescue team he thought was infallible, had been torn to shreds in the face of her terrifyingly perfect data. She wasn't reacting emotionally to past wounds. From her ruthless position as lead geologist, she was simply stepping on the fatal error of a stupid capitalist. He opened his mouth to speak, but from his throat, as if it were packed with broken glass, he couldn't emit a single syllable. Just then, the tent flap opened again, and a sturdy young man in a blue federal uniform walked in carrying a thermos. Silas Alden, deputy commander of the National Response Team. Alara, your leg. Silas walked straight past Sterling, who stood there looking like a ghost, and handed Alara the thermos. With his other hand, in a smooth, entirely natural gesture, he pressed a small, chemical heating pad to the outside of her left knee. The temperature dropped too fast. Those 14 screws in your bone are going to give you hell. Alara took the thermos and replied with a soft voice that seemed to ease the tension slightly. Thanks. The heat is perfect. Exactly 98.6 degrees, just like you said it. Evac route confirmed? Silas asked, smiling as he turned his gaze to the map. A few feet away, Sterling, watching this entire scene, was hit by an explosive spasm in his stomach. The pain wasn't from the biting cold, but from an extreme misery and regret, as if his flesh were being melted off his bones. Once, she knew his every habit by heart. The 180, degree tea, the 113, degree broth, his pills sorted into 7 daily compartments. Now, it was another man taking care of her with perfect numbers. And that man even knew the intimate secret of the 14 titanium screws in her knee. And she accepted that care willingly. All of this was happening 6 years after he had thrown her away with his own hands. Sterling slowly backed up 2 steps. Once past the yellow control line, he clenched his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. But he felt no pain. By 3:15 a.m., the blizzard had slightly died down, but the ambient temperature had plummeted to -2 degrees Fahrenheit. The entire camp personnel were frantically preparing for the final retreat. The heavy machinery was abandoned in place, their engines dead. In their place was only the deafening, blade-like howl of the wind. Alara sat alone in the mobile communications center parked at the edge of the camp, reviewing the final detonation coordinates. To prevent the server racks from overheating, the environmental heating inside the truck was disabled. It was brutally cold. A freezing chill rose from the metal floorboards, and from deep within her left knee, a familiar, agonizing pain spread outward. The 14 titanium screws contracted in the extreme cold, causing a piercing agony, as if needles were scraping the insides of her bones. The hand typing on the keyboard stopped, her brow furrowed, and the blood drained from her face. She unzipped her parka and pulled a small, unlabeled bottle of white pills from an inner pocket. She shook 2 heavy-duty painkillers into her palm. There was no water in the truck, but without blinking, she tilted her head back and dry swallowed them. The pills scratched her dry throat, leaving a metallic taste. Her fingers trembled imperceptibly in midair before pressing hard into her thigh above her knee. She rested her forehead against the freezing metal control panel, allowing herself in this empty space. For exactly 5 seconds, a moment of weakness. The aftermath of that crash was a terrible nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After 5 seconds, the demolition team's radio crackled. Commander, point 1 primed. Ilara took a deep breath, repressed the trembling in her leg, and forced her gaze to turn glacial once more. Copy. Hold your position. Just then, heavy footsteps crunching through the snow approached the outside of the truck. Ilara didn't even turn her head. Keeping her eyes locked on the screen, she said, "Have the blast coordinates been confirmed?" No response. Instead, a ragged, choked breathing sounded strangely at the entrance of the quiet truck. Ilara turned. Sterling stood in the doorway. His massive frame completely blocked out the raging blizzard behind him. A layer of white frost covered the shoulders of his expedition suit, and his lips were purple from the freeze. One hand was pressed hard against his spazzing stomach, knuckles white, while the other held a dented military metal canteen, steam rising from it. Who knew how long he had stood out there in the -22-degree blizzard, waiting with hot milk scrounged from the logistics team? Despite the agonizing cramps tearing at his gut, he stubbornly held onto that cup like a lost child seeking redemption. "How is your leg?" Sterling's voice was terribly hoarse, like sandpaper. It seemed every word cost him immense physical effort. He took a cautious step forward and offered her the metal cup. In his eyes was a desperate, almost servile pleading. "Drink something warm. You'll feel better." Ilara looked at the steaming cup. It was the first time in 6 years he had tried to take care of her, and he was doing it in an incredibly clumsy, pathetic way. If this had been 6 years ago in the penthouse, she would have been moved to tears. But now, looking at that milk, not even a shred of mockery surfaced in her heart. She didn't reach for it. Instead, Ilara reached into the console bin and pulled out a laser rangefinder. She pressed the trigger with her thumb. With a sharp beep, a red laser cut through the dark cabin and landed dead center on Sterling's chest. The digital screen displayed a number, 2.6 feet. Mr. Thorne. Ilara's gaze shifted from the milk to his face. Her voice was completely devoid of inflection. "You're blocking my scan." Sterling's hand, holding the cup, jerked. "Step 2 paces to the left," Ilara said with an objective, cruel tone, as if stating a law of physics. "Your core body heat is bleeding into the background and interfering with the thermal imaging array set up behind you." Then, pointing the laser rangefinder at the red dot on his chest, she looked him dead in the eye. Federal Emergency Management Protocol, Article 4. Untrained civilian personnel must maintain a minimum safety distance of 5 feet from the incident commander. Sterling's pupils violently contracted. Looking into her emotionless eyes, he realized a truth more terrifying than hatred. She didn't hate him. Hate is an emotion. And if there is emotion, it means there is still a shred of regret. But she felt absolutely nothing for him. She was simply enforcing the textbook safety distance, just as she once perfectly regulated the temperature of his bathwater. Now, with that same flawless logic and precision, she was completely isolating him from her world. A stomach cramp hit him again, like a blade slicing him open. Sterling doubled over in pain. Cold sweat dripped from his pale chin onto the floorboards. He looked down at the milk in his hand, which was rapidly losing heat. "Okay." Sterling gritted his teeth and spat out a broken sound, like a dying animal. A single tear fell from his eye, freezing instantly as it hit the rim of the cup. Dragging legs as stiff as tree trunks, he very slowly backed away. The number on the rangefinder ticked up. 5 feet. Coordinates confirmed. Ilara tossed the rangefinder onto the desk and hit the comms button. "All personnel, stand by. Evacuation commences in 5 minutes." She turned and slammed the truck's weather door shut, completely blocking Sterling from her sight. Left alone in the blizzard, exactly 5 feet away behind the invisible control line, Sterling stared at her unyielding, focused silhouette through the frost-covered glass. Then, he slowly lowered his head to look at the cup of milk in his hand. A thin layer of ice had already formed on the surface, A hollow, agonizing laugh more miserable than a sob escaped his lips. Beep, beep, beep. At 4:20 a.m., deafening red sirens shattered the night sky over Camp 3. Dozens of high-precision tilt sensors installed on the southeast rock wall began screaming in unison. Flashing red emergency lights cut through the blizzard, dyeing the snow blood red. Alara kicked open the comms truck door and vaulted out into snow that reached her ankles. Sitrep on all teams. Her eyes, as she gripped the radio, were as sharp as knives, and she spoke at maximum speed. Team 2 reporting massive groundwater breach from Mine 3. Water is highly turbid. Team 4 reporting bedrock stress sensors critical. Exceeded 80% threshold. The camp instantly turned into an inferno of chaos. Hundreds of workers and support staff poured out of the tents. Panic, fueled by the deep, guttural roar of the mountain tearing itself apart underground, spread like a plague. Mr. Thorne, the vehicle is ready. Hayes, flanked by heavily armed bodyguards, was trying to evacuate Sterling toward the east. A military-grade armored SUV was waiting there, capable of easily withstanding a minor avalanche. But Sterling, passing by the command truck, stopped. He turned and looked at Alara, who was calmly monitoring the data streams in the middle of the blizzard. His pupils shrank. "Bring the armored truck here," Sterling ordered, ignoring the bodyguard's protests. He sprinted toward Alara. Alara was staring hard at a tablet screen, watching the red curve of the groundwater levels spike vertically. "Alara!" Sterling yelled to be heard over the wind as he approached. "Come with me right now." Alara didn't even lift her head. She swiped her finger across the screen to pull up the topo map. "This isn't a joke." Sterling looked at her impassive profile, his breathing erratic. His desire for control, which had brought him to the pinnacle of power, reawakened in this extreme terror. "My armored truck is right behind us. I paid off a local guide, a master tracker. Lynx Ridge is the only survival route not buried in snow. Get in the truck now. We're taking that route." Alara finally stopped swiping. She turned and looked at Sterling's panic-stricken face. "Lynx Ridge," she spat the words out. Her calm lacked any hesitation. "It has the thickest surface bedrock." Sterling was convinced. He was a man used to buying the perfect answer with money and power. The guide swore his life on it. Alara didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply turned the tablet in her hand and shoved it inches from Sterling's face. On the screen, the Lynx Ridge path was highlighted with a blinding red line, and directly beneath that line was a massive, dark purple void. "The surface bedrock of Lynx Ridge is thick, yes." Alara's voice cut through the storm and hammered into Sterling's eardrums. "But directly beneath it is the Sector 3 mine, the massive cavern created by the dynamite your company illegally detonated." Sterling's breath caught in his throat. His eyelids spasmed out of control. "If the groundwater breaches, that will become the primary sinkhole. It will be the first section of the mountain to cave in." Alara didn't pause. "The guide you bought with your money just sold you a one-way ticket to hell." She pulled the tablet back, delivering an objective, cruel verdict. "In 7 minutes, Lynx Ridge will completely collapse." The moment she finished speaking, a deafening, eardrum-shattering boom exploded from deep within the earth. The snow beneath their feet trembled violently, like a giant beast waking and thrashing about. Warning. Mountain fragmentation rate. 87%. A mechanical voice blared from the loudspeakers, initiating the final countdown. At that exact moment, the ground beneath Sterling's armored SUV, parked at the east end of the camp, gave way without warning. Like a lightning strike, the ice shelf shattered. A massive geyser of groundwater mixed with mud shot into the air. In a matter of seconds, the multi-ton armored vehicle, along with the entrance to Lynx Ridge, was swallowed by the abyss, with a sound of crunching metal, plummeting into darkness. Sterling stood frozen, staring at the catastrophe unfolding barely 100 feet away. For 3 seconds, his mind went completely blank. The knuckles of his clenched fists were stark white. If Alara had listened to him and gotten into that truck, they would be bloody pulp under thousands of tons of rock right now. The privilege of capital he was so proud of, his iron shield against ruthless nature, was nothing but lethal, empty air. Crack! The massive tower crane erected in the center of the camp, unable to withstand the ground subsiding, let out a screech of tearing metal. Its gigantic steel arm, weighing tens of thousands of pounds, began plummeting directly toward the command truck. Alara! Sterling's eyes turned bloodshot, and an agonizing scream tore from his lungs. His body reacted faster than logic. He threw his arms wide, lunging forward like a madman to cover her and shield her with his own body. In this final moment, he needed to reclaim his right as her husband, her protector. From Alara's left knee, a sharp pain shot up like a spike. When the ground shook, the titanium screws had ground against the bone. Instinctively, she gritted her teeth, the color draining from her face. But in the fraction of a second when Sterling lunged at her, she didn't close her eyes. She didn't hide in his arms. She planted all her weight on her healthy right leg, and with her right hand, she grabbed a heavy titanium surveying tripod, weighing nearly 30 pounds, that stood beside her. Smack! The solid titanium rod struck Sterling squarely in the chest with millimeter precision. His forward momentum was instantly shattered by the cold metal bar, violently repelling him backward. Ugh! Sterling grunted like an animal, the blunt force trauma triggering another horrific spasm in his stomach. Move, Alara spat, looking at him. Just one word. Not an emotional scream. Not a desperate shove. She had simply pushed him back 2 steps with the tripod, the exact way one would sweep aside a rock blocking the path. In that same moment, the massive steel crane grazed the edge of the command truck and smashed into the snow, sending shrapnel flying everywhere. Clutching his chest, Sterling fell to his knees in the snow. With bloodshot eyes, he looked up at her. His gaze held a mix of shock, despair, and an infinite sense of helplessness. She had rejected his protection. Even in a life-or-death hellscape, she preferred to fend him off with a cold piece of metal, rather than allow him to touch her again. Alara didn't spare him a single glance. She drove the tripod into the snow to support herself, grabbed the iron ladder on the side of the command truck, and climbed to the roof without hesitation. The blizzard was at its peak. The roof of the truck was the most dangerous, exposed point in the entire camp, but it also offered the most perfect, unobstructed vantage point. Alara, are you crazy? Get down right now! Silas yelled desperately from below, but Alara ignored him. Once on the roof, a gust of wind hit her so hard, it felt like it was trying to rip the jacket from her body. She swayed slightly, but a second later, she planted her feet on the roof, as immovable as an iron nail. She ripped off her face mask and grabbed a bullhorn. Attention all personnel! This is the incident commander. Alara's voice, clear and razor-sharp, sliced through the roar of the collapsing mountain and echoed across the camp. Abandon all rations. Abandon all vehicles. Everyone move immediately to the 4-5-degree ridge above exploration shaft. 4 to the northwest. That is a basalt zone it will hold. Do not run in a straight line. Follow the yellow zigzag markers. Avoid the major sinkholes. The hundreds of panicked workers, previously scattering like headless ants, heard that absolutely ruthless, authoritative order and immediately shifted direction, running as one toward the northwest ridge as if they had found a lighthouse in the dark. The sound of the mountain splitting grew deafening. A massive boulder rolled off a cliff face and obliterated the mess tent where people had been gathered just moments before. Cut the main power grid right now, Alara screamed from above, pointing at the massive generators. When the power supervisor hesitated, her voice took on a lethal edge. Do you want to watch everyone here fry when the live wires hit the groundwater? Pull the breaker. The supervisor shivered and punched the main kill switch. The camp plunged into darkness, illuminated only by erratic searchlights slicing frantically through the blizzard. Alara stood on the roof, directing everything with cold efficiency. Due to the extreme cold, her left leg, having remained stationary for too long, began to lose feeling and tremble. The 14 titanium screws, shifting as if rusting inside the bone, sent shooting agony through her with every micro-movement. She swallowed the taste of blood rising in her throat, clenched her fists so tightly her nails broke the skin, and maintained her absolutely upright posture. Sterling was being dragged by haze toward the safe northwest ridge. Standing among the crowd, he looked back up at the woman standing on the truck roof. Cutting through the madness of the storm, she was a complete stranger. The woman who, 5 years ago, used to hide in his arms during thunderstorms. The woman who, if she nicked her finger while cooking, would tear up. Now, she stood in a hurricane-force blizzard at 9,000 feet, the mountain crumbling into a dark abyss beneath her feet, a chaotic storm raging above her head. With precise, no-nonsense commands, She held the lives of hundreds of people in the palm of her hand. Every calculation was as accurate as a god's. Every decision as sharp as a knife. She was a massive, unapproachable glacier. She radiated a blinding light that made his heart physically ache. Sterling's lips trembled. He watched as she verified the retreat of the very last man. She calculated the absolute final second before the bedrock would give way, and only then did she grab a safety line and vault off the roof. Exactly 10 seconds after Alara jumped, the massive ice shelf supporting Camp 3 let out a dying screech and collapsed completely. A gaping maw in the earth swallowed the command truck, the remaining tents, and the heavy gear. A massive plume of snow and debris exploded upward, entirely blocking their line of sight. "Ilara!" Silas's agonizing scream tore through the storm. Sterling felt as if his heart were being crushed by an invisible hand. Like a madman, he violently shoved Hayes away and sprinted blindly into the wall of white dust. No. She can't die. Absolutely not. After he ran several yards, the dense snow fog slowly began to clear. Alara was kneeling on solid bedrock, a mere 6 feet from the edge of the newly formed sinkhole. One hand had a death grip on an ice axe buried deep in the rock. The other rested in the snow as she panted heavily. Her dark blue parka was a mess of mud and bloodstains. She slowly pushed herself up. She didn't look back at the dark abyss behind her, nor at the faces of anyone rushing toward her. She simply brushed the blood off her knees, yanked the ice axe free, and walked step by agonizing step toward the northwest ridge. Sterling stopped dead 10 yards from her. He watched her approach. Her gait was slightly hitched, her ability to bear weight on her left leg clearly compromised. As she walked past him, Sterling's gaze happened to drop to her left knee. The outer shell of her tactical pants was torn from the jump and the friction. Through the rip, he saw something stuck to the thermal base layer beneath. It was the chemical heating pad Silas had given her, now completely cold and dead. And beneath that pad, on her exposed skin, was a massive, horrific, dark purple hematoma caused by capillaries bursting under extreme pressure. It was the heartbreaking evidence of 14 steel screws that, enduring stress far beyond human limits, had nearly breached her flesh. Sterling stopped breathing. He truly realized the inhuman, terrifying pain she had endured while standing on that roof for 20 minutes, calmly directing the evacuation. She hadn't made a sound. She hadn't begged anyone to save her. She hadn't shown a single second of weakness. She had swallowed all that agony alone, and with a body made of steel, she had saved the hundreds of people here, including Sterling himself. Sterling's Adam's apple bobbed violently. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask if she was in pain. He wanted to tell her how terrified he had been. But he couldn't get a word out, because Ilara had already walked right past him without a glance, leaving him only her resolute, freezing back. Deputy Alden. Ilara approached Silas and ordered in a calm, gravelly voice. "Get a head count and prep the survivors to move out on foot toward Camp 2. Silas, looking at her pale face, showed deep concern in his eyes. He didn't ask questions. He simply gave a firm nod. "Understood, Commander." Sterling was left standing alone. The blizzard coated his shoulders in white frost in an instant. He watched Alara's silhouette blend in with the blue uniforms of the Federal Rescue Team. The Thorn Capital construction workers, who used to bow and scrape before Sterling, now looked at Alara with an almost divine reverence. She didn't need him anymore. She didn't need his Tom Ford jacket, the guide bought with dirty money, or his elite private security team. She was her own blazing sun on this mountain of mud and snow. Sterling slowly lowered his head. A terrible cramp ripped through his stomach, mixing with a piercing regret that made it impossible for his massive frame to remain standing. Thud. He fell heavily to his knees in the snow. A hot liquid, which he could no longer hold back, poured from his eyes. The tears dropped onto the freezing snow, melting little craters into the ice. In the middle of the blizzard, the arrogant, multi-billionaire titan of Wall Street who had dominated the city knelt in the dirt like a homeless man who had lost everything. He wept like an animal from the depths of his soul. Bring up 3 more support beams for that sector. Dial down the ambient heaters. Move the backup generator over here. Absolute priority on the critical casualties. At 6:15 a.m. the next morning, at Camp 2, a grayish dawn broke through the heavy clouds. The blizzard had transitioned into a freezing rain mixed with sharp sleet. Alara stood outside the makeshift medical tent, radio in hand, firing off orders to the logistics team. A crust of ice had formed on her blue parka, crackling with her every movement. Copy that. Medevac choppers inbound in 3 hours. Alara clicked off the radio and hooked it to her belt. As she turned to walk toward the supply truck parked at the edge of the camp, her left leg dragged slightly with every step, showing signs of temporary paralysis. She stepped into the dark shadow behind the heavy transport truck, unlatched the metal door, and, leaning heavily on the floorboard, pulled herself up into the cargo bay, pulling the door shut behind her. In the cramped, dark bay, she was finally alone. Leaning against a crate of MREs, she allowed the tension in her back, rigid for the entire night, to finally collapse. Ugh. She inhaled the freezing air sharply. Her right hand gripped the fabric of her pants over her left thigh as if trying to rip it off. Bent completely in half, her hands trembling violently, she unzipped the side of her tactical pants. The pale skin over her left knee joint was grotesquely swollen, almost unbearable to look at. Around the area where she had taken the impact from last night's jump, a blackish-purple bruising had spread. It looked as though the 14 titanium screws beneath the subcutaneous tissue, unable to bear the extreme cold and the overload, were threatening to pierce straight through her skin. The heating pad, long devoid of warmth, had hardened, its edges peeling up. Alara, her expression impassive, pinched the corner of the pad and violently ripped it off. Zzz! A ragged, animalistic groan escaped her throat. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead, sliding down her brow to drop onto the truck's steel floor. She reached into her pocket for the bottle of white pills, but her fingers were shaking so badly she couldn't even grip the cap between her thumb and forefinger. Clack! The bottle slipped from her hand and hit the metal deck. The white painkillers scattered across the filthy floor, rolling into the cracks between the crates. Alara stared down at the pills. Her chest heaved heavily. She closed her eyes, rested the back of her head against the freezing steel wall, and forced herself to take 3 deep breaths. After 3 seconds, she opened her eyes and leaned down. Using 2 fingers, she picked up 2 pills that looked relatively clean, having landed near a muddy boot print. There was no water. She tilted her head back, tossed the pills into her mouth, and with immense effort, forced them down her dry throat. Bang, bang. Suddenly, the metal door of the truck rattled. Alara froze for a second. She immediately zipped up her pants, straightened her spine, and kicked the empty pill bottle under a crate. The pain and weakness etched on her face were wiped clean in half a second, replaced once again by an impenetrable mask of ice. Enter. A calm, glacial voice. The heavy metal door slowly creaked open, letting in a gust of freezing sleet. Sterling stood below the tailgate. No umbrella. His tens of thousands of dollars expedition suit was unrecognizable, caked in mud and dried blood from the collapse of Camp 3. His face was devoid of blood, and his lips were a bruised purple. His right hand was still pressed hard against his spazzing stomach, and in his left hand, he held a dented khaki military thermos cup. A thin layer of ice had frozen around the rim. Standing inside the truck bed, Alara looked down at him with an arrogant detachment. Her gaze didn't linger on the cup, nor did she ask why he was there. Placing a hand on the tailgate, she vaulted down to the ground. The moment her left foot hit the mud, a pain that felt like it was severing her brainstem shot through her. But her posture didn't waver a single millimeter. She turned to walk away. Alara! Sterling's voice was horribly raspy, as if he had swallowed sand. He took a step forward, blocking her path. The distance between them was less than 3 feet. Alara didn't step back to maintain the safety distance. She simply looked at him with calm eyes. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "The damage assessment report for Thorne Capital's lost equipment will be emailed to your office within 3 business days by the Federal Review Board. If you're here to discuss insurance claims, you have the wrong person." Sterling's eyelids trembled. Looking into her eyes deep as a bottomless well, void of any emotion, he felt his heart cramp. "I'm not here to talk about money." His breathing was incredibly unstable. With a stiff, shaking hand, he offered her the cup. "You were on that roof all night. It was so cold. Your leg." He cut himself off, suppressing a violent stomach cramp with all his strength. "I got a camp stove from Logistics. I heated this up. It took a while because the flame kept dying and I had to find a windproof lighter." His tone was steeped in a spine-chilling subservience. "I warmed it, but it might have cooled down a bit. Drink this. Warm your stomach. Taking painkillers on an empty stomach will ruin you." Alara looked down at the metal cup, the thin sheet of ice coating the white liquid. This was the result of his desperate, pathetic efforts. battling the blizzard all night just to heat something up for her. 5 years ago, in the New York penthouse, when he came home at 3 a.m. after a gala, groaning on the sofa from stomach cramps, she would stand in the kitchen in a thin silk robe. Using a spoon, she would carefully cool his gastric medication broth to exactly 113 degrees before feeding it to him. He, without even opening his eyes, would swallow it as if it were his birthright. Before walking upstairs, he would merely say, "Make it hotter next time." Now the roles were reversed. Shivering in sub-zero sleet, he was offering her a cup of freezing milk, begging. Alara didn't take the cup. "Sterling." Her voice was low, but it possessed a penetrating force that pierced straight to his bones. "Your hand is shaking." Sterling flinched, then forced a crooked smile onto his purple lips, as if to prove he was fine. "It doesn't hurt. I'm just a bit cold. The stomach ulcers are a chronic issue, you know. Don't worry about me." He seemed to have misunderstood, thinking her words came from a place of concern. A pathetic glimmer of hope flashed in his bloodshot eyes. "You aren't shaking from the cold," Alara said, staring at his hand and delivering a clinically perfect diagnosis. "That tremor frequency is symptomatic of physiological shock when blood glucose drops below 70 milligrams per deciliter. It means you haven't eaten in over 24 hours. She raised her eyes, piercing him with a sharp glare. "Furthermore, that milk expired last month. It thawed and refroze multiple times when the generators failed last night, breeding severe bacterial loads. With your bleeding chronic ulcers and your severely compromised immune system, drinking that right now will trigger gastrointestinal sepsis. At 9,000 feet in a blizzard with no medevac available, your mortality rate hits 100%. The hope in Sterling's eyes froze instantly. His fingers locked up, the ice inside the cup clinking softly. You see, Alara's tone was as objective as an algorithm. "You are completely incapable of taking care of your own body. You can't even heat up a cup of milk properly. What right do you think you have to worry about me?" Sterling's Adam's apple bobbed violently. Even though the tearing cramps in his gut made it nearly impossible to stand, he gritted his teeth and held on. "I know I was a piece of shit." A broken voice, mixed with a desperate sob, forced its way out of his throat. He reached out to grab the hem of her parka. I didn't know. I didn't know you gave up so much for me. I thought providing the money, maintaining the image of the marriage, was enough. Alara, I truly didn't know anything. It's not that you didn't know." Alara cut him off, shifting slightly to evade his grasp. "It's that you felt there was no need to know." Sterling's hand stopped in midair. "That accident." Alara looked him dead in the eye, unflinching. "You claimed you didn't recognize the license plate on my car, correct?" "I swear I didn't see it." Sterling scrambled to justify himself, his bloodshot eyes looking as if they were about to weep blood. "It was pouring, and my mind was entirely focused on Corrine. I really didn't see you." "Mr. Thorne. The security app on your phone syncs directly to your dashcam and my car's GPS tracker, does it not?" Alara's voice was terrifyingly calm. Sterling stopped breathing. "That afternoon, a fraction of a second before you stepped out of your car, Hayes sent you a frantic text alerting you that my GPS signal had suddenly stopped at Columbus Circle. At the exact same moment, your live dashcam feed popped up on your screen, clearly displaying the mangled white sedan and its license plate right in front of you, didn't it? But you were too busy looking at Corrine crying in the rain. You calculated the liability. And you swiped the alert away?" Sterling's pupils shrank to pinpricks. That night, while the rain lashed against the windows, a split second before he opened his door to step out, his phone had buzzed. He had glanced at the screen. In the flashing red alert box, there was an all-too-familiar license plate number, but in that exact moment, he saw Corrine crying in the rain. Corrine was the lead actress the production studio he had just heavily invested in was promoting a diversion he was currently interested in. The woman who owned that plate, however, was his silent, flawless wife, who would always be docilely waiting at home. In that fraction of a second, he had calculated the return on investment in the most purely capitalistic way possible. He swiped the alert away with his thumb. He had deleted that plate from his mind completely. He had lied to everyone, and for the past 6 years, he had perfectly deceived even himself, firmly believing he had never seen it. Alara looked down at Sterling's desperate corpse-pale face with eyes devoid of any warmth. "Did you swipe that notification away? Or not?" That single sentence from Alara utterly annihilated the fragile self-justification he had spent 6 years building. 1 second before stepping out of the car, he had completed his ROI calculation. A moderately frightened mistress offers submissive validation and emotional satisfaction, while a bleeding wife brings only complications and liability. No, Alara, it wasn't like that. Sterling shook his head like a madman. He wanted to scream, but only a metallic rasp came from his throat. Finally, his legs lost all their strength. He fell heavily to his knees in the freezing mud. The metal cup in his hand rolled onto the ground. Clatter. The icy milk spilled, mixing with the filthy dirt into a disgusting gray slush. Alara looked down at the man on his knees. The billionaire titan who had ruled Wall Street and trampled her pride for 5 years was now shivering at her feet, clutching his stomach like a stray dog. Mr. Thorne. Alara stepped back half a pace, drawing a perfect boundary line, and handed down the final verdict on their reunion after 6 years. Your time is up. Her voice, slicing through the freezing sleet, landed clear and sharp. There was zero trace of regret. Over the past 6 years, I have never once spoken your name. Because there was simply no need to. Sterling snapped his head up. His lips trembled violently. Finally, the tears he had been holding back burst forth like a collapsing dam. They streamed down his pale cheeks, dropping into the mud. He wanted to reach out and grab the cuff of her pants. He wanted to beg her not to go, to tell her he would rip his own heart out just to show her. But Alara didn't give him a single second. She turned without hesitation and marched with firm, resolute steps toward the federal medevac helicopter that had just landed, its rotors roaring deafeningly. At 9:15 a.m., the distant rumble of the mountains settling echoed through the valley. Alara pulled the zipper of her parka all the way up, adjusted the straps of her faded 6.5-liter Osprey backpack, and, without ever looking back, disappeared into the chopper. And Sterling he remained, kneeling alone in the raging blizzard at 9,000 feet, staring at the cold tears and mud left on his fingertips, sobbing until he couldn't breathe, reaching toward a light that had once been the brightest thing in his world, a light he could now never ever touch again.